Thank you very much, moderator, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today for this very exciting event. So I'd like to really thank the moderator and the organizers here and the state of Penang for inviting us to be at this forum with you all today. So my topic is to talk to you about climate change impact on biodiversity, and for us to really understand what is going on with regard to the climate and all the things that we see around us, life on Earth, that's biodiversity, the plants, the animals, and us, okay? So before I begin, let me just introduce you to WWF. We were formed in 1961, and hence we are about the same age as Malaysia, just slightly younger. We have offices in over 100 countries in 5 continents. We have a staff strength of about 5,000 members. In Malaysia, we are about 200, and we are spread out all over Malaysia. We have offices in Sabah, in Kota Kinabalu, Kudat, Sempurna, Lahad Datu, in Sarawak, in Kuching, also in Peninsula, here in Penang, as well as PJ, Setiu, and so on. And we have, in terms of support, about over 5 million supporters throughout the world. They support us in our campaigns. They also support us with funding. So our work, we are a science-based, non-profit organization, and we work on conservation of biological resources, biodiversity, and also ecosystems. So the topic before us today is pretty vast. If you think about it, biodiversity is everything around us, as I mentioned, all the flora, all the fauna. So to put it into context, let's take a journey, a short journey through the recent times. As you know, the climate is something that is and does always constantly change. If you look at it from geological time perspective, there have been many cycles. We've gone through ice ages, and it's caused impacts on the species that can continue to thrive on this planet. So this cycle has been going on. We all know about the dinosaurs, their time, and then the extinction. So this is actually a natural process. However, I'm going to focus on a very much shorter period of time, just before the industrial age, and coming into what is now informally known as the Anthropocene, which is actually time when human activity is causing a lot of impact on the environment and the climate. Okay, that's what's been happening in the industrial age. And then I will move on to what we can do about it, how we need to really move towards what we can call the age of sustainable development. So in my presentation, I will mainly focus on the impacts on biodiversity, particularly those that we find around us here in Malaysia. We are very fortunate. We are a mega biodiverse rich country, one of the 12 mega biodiverse rich countries in the world. And so I thought I'll mainly focus on what's happening around here, but I'll also touch upon some of the examples of the impacts of climate change that's occurring elsewhere. So in terms of the pre-industrial age, that's about, say, 300 odd years ago, what we had was vast tracts of forests, lots of amazing biodiversity, and we also had human activity, but this was somewhat limited by either the ability of man to do work, so it's human energy itself, or by man being able to harness some of the animals around to provide some additional strength, and some basic tools like the cart you see over there. So primarily, if you think about it, resources were in abundance. It was everywhere. And the limiting factor at that time was man's ability to access these resources, because they could only use human strength, human energy, and maybe a little bit of domesticated animal assistance as well. So this is a very quick depiction of what the pre-industrial society was. You had small urban populations, pretty poor land tenure. You had huge areas of wilderness and megafauna and large carnivores still present very rampantly. And in terms of agriculture, it was mainly subsistent agriculture. So people planted for their own needs, and that's pretty much how it went. Then came the industrial age. Of course, pre-industrial age, they also had their challenges. I mean, you can imagine how difficult it must have been to have to basically provide for yourself everything using just human strength and human energies. So that was a time when, there were a lot of diseases. You did not have these modern amenities of electricity, water, pipes. People had to go to wells to pick up all these basic necessities that we all take for granted today. However, that did come with a price. So when the industrial age happened, suddenly we had machineries to help us. And these machineries used energy, fossil energy, that had been stored in the earth, as petrol, dinosaur fossil fuel in the earth, was extracted, and it started helping us extract resources around us. So you can see you have factories, and these factories are polluting. They create a lot of pollutants, and they emit it into the atmosphere. Agriculture became more and more, it grew in size, became monoculture, and that picture over there shows pesticides being spread by machines. Waste, we started generating lots of waste. Deforestation, of course, we needed more land, so more and more natural spaces were encroached upon for us to access those lands. Very intensified agriculture. And of course, to move us around, transportation has become really important, and that's also causing a problem. So, in terms of what a post-industrial society diagrammatically would represent, you have large-scale industries, large urban population, pretty limited areas of wilderness, intensifying agriculture, and now you also have the strong land tenure where people have proprietary rights over land. So what has all this caused? Apart from resource depletion, degradation of natural space, it's also caused this effect of emitting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. As the YB mentioned earlier, the greenhouse gases, we have carbon dioxide, that's the one that we are most familiar with, methane, that is generated from agricultural activities, and nitrous oxide from the fertilizers we use. These are the three main greenhouse gases. So more and more of these greenhouse gases have been emitted into the atmosphere. Now greenhouse gases themselves are not bad. They are in fact necessary for life on Earth, because they act as a blanket around the Earth, and they trap the sun's energy to keep some of that heat so that we can actually live and thrive on planet Earth. However, we are tipping the balance because we are releasing more and more of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And what's happening is that blanket effect, that blanket is becoming thicker and thicker and thicker. So you can imagine more and more heat is being trapped, and things are actually changing. This data here shows you diagrammatically that in fact, yes, we can see that there's more heat that's getting trapped within the Earth system. So if you see In the before 80s, it was kind of, up and down a little bit. But in 1980, in the 80s, that was the warmest decade on record at that time. But that was quickly superseded by the 90s, because that decade was even warmer than the 80s. And then when it came to the 2000s, that became the warmest decade on record. And likewise, into this millennium, we are seeing that we are also seeing the same pattern, the same trend. So in terms of records, in terms of data, the evidence shows that the Earth's average temperature is indeed on the rise. So what are the indicators, if you'd like, if you wanted to look at it from another perspective, what are the indicators of a warming world? You would see a rise in humidity, rise in air temperature near surface, air temperature, temperature rise over the oceans, sea surface temperature rise, ocean heat content rise, temperature over land rise. And on top of that, you'll also observe that glaciers would melt, snow cover would melt, sea ice would melt, hence resulting in sea level rise. So these are the 10 indicators, and all 10 indicators have been observed to occur. So how does this impact biodiversity? I will describe it from maybe starting with the species, the turtles. We are fortunate, we play host to 4 of these turtles that come to our beaches to nest, or at least they used to. Some of them may not come anymore. You can see that they are all marked, as being endangered, critically endangered, and so on. That is largely due to man's activities. Our fishing activities end up catching these big turtles and they die, or we poach their eggs so their survival rates are reduced. So there are already existing stressors threatening the survival of these species. However, on top of that, climate change adds to this. So if you know, of course, that turtles come on land during the nesting season, and the turtles are actually born on beaches. Now, when you have temperatures on the rise, what happens is the coast, the beaches as well, the temperature of the beach sand also increases. Now, this actually affects the sex ratio of the eggs that the turtles lay. It's dependent on the temperature. So if it's cooler climate, that's preferable to the males. You have the cool dudes coming out. Temperatures rising. The female of the species prefer this. You have the hot chicks coming out. Okay? So you can just imagine if temperatures continue to rise, there's going to be an imbalance, and that's certainly going to threaten the viability of the species. In addition to that, it's been observed through some scientific experiments that the ability of the turtles after they hatch to swim out, they actually have to, as soon as they hatch, they make this extremely long journey out into the open seas. Their ability to swim is impeded with this kind of hotter temperatures. So if that's impeded, they fall prey to, the big fish and so on that are around more easily, and again their survival is threatened. Orangutans, mammals, they are also affected by climate change. Again, climate change compounds the already existing threats that our activities have imposed upon them. Already there's fragmentation of their habitats. We encroach upon their habitats to, change land use into agricultural land or into developments. But over and above that, with temperature rise, the risk of forest fires becomes greater, and it also affects fruiting period. Orangutans rely on fruits, so one of the impacts of climate change is extreme weathers. I think all of you have probably experienced that our rainfall patterns have changed. We have more rainfall at certain times of the year and less rainfall at other times of the year, almost dry spells, something that we never used to have in the past. So the total amount of rainfall we have annually remains the same, but when it comes has changed quite drastically. So this will also affect fruiting and flowering periods, and hence the very food source that animals rely on. So all these other species are also equally going to be threatened by these kind of impacts: habitat loss, loss of food source, and change also in the hospitability of the habitats that they occupy. Okay? This is one of the habitats. It's also biodiversity, coral reefs. What will happen to coral reefs? Again, there are already existing stressors. The pollutants we put into the oceans are already stressing the viability of these coral reefs. But added to that, climate change is also going to have a negative impact. How so? The oceans, play many roles. One of which is to act as a carbon sink. So quite a lot of the carbon that we put out ends up being absorbed by the oceans. However, in doing so, the oceans start getting acidified. There's ocean acidification occurring. So the pH levels of the ocean start to drop. Now when this happens, it's difficult for calcification to happen, which is what promotes coral growth. So coral growth becomes stunted. Another effect is when you have global warming. As we saw earlier, the temperature of the sea rises as well. Now when this happens, when it goes beyond certain optimal ranges, it results in coral bleaching, because the algae that is in the coral that provides its beautiful colors and also nutrients for the growth of the coral gets expelled out. So you can see that climate change actually compounds the existing stressors and could possibly cause a dieback of coral reefs. Now what would this mean? This would mean that many fish use this as their spawning ground, the coral reefs. They lose the ability, or the area where they would normally be breeding, and their nursery basically. Likewise, forests, of course, these are the habitat for terrestrial animals. Again, you have forest fires with increasing temperatures. You also have shifting ranges and distributions. So this would be especially seen at, say, in the montane areas, where species that used to occupy the highest levels of the montane area will have nowhere else to migrate to. They can't go anywhere further. They will just have to die off. Species from lower elevations will start occupying the space that they used to occupy. Likewise, if you have coastal areas and a sea level rise and the sea is encroaching upon the land, and if there's no space for biodiversity to move inwards, inland, they have also lost their habitat and ability to live. Now the other thing is disease. Changing climate will bring about various types of disease, and these effects, they don't actually work, in just one at a time. They don't occur just one at a time. When they happen, they are very complex and they come all together sometimes. And I'll show you an example of this right now. This is an example from the United States. the plight of the pinyon tree. The pinyon tree provides those pine nuts that you sometimes eat with salads and so on. We've seen that with climate change, you have warmer winters, severe drought incidences, heat waves, and frequent fires. And these have all had an impact on the pinyon tree. What happens with higher temperatures is the tree, which produces a sap, is less able to do so. And that sap is actually something that acts as a defense mechanism against pests. So its resilience, its ability to fight off the pests is reduced. At the same time, the pest itself has less winter mortality because now the climate is warmer and it's able to increase its range. It was found that instead of one life cycle, it now has 2 life cycles, and hence its population has gone on the rise. So this has had a severe impact on these poor pine trees. So the greenhouse gases caused global warming, which led to warmer winters. With the sap that it produces, the tree produces as a defense mechanism being reduced, and then the beetles being able to attack it more easily. And because of the beetle infestation, the trees die, there's a risk of more forest fires, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And the forest fires means release of more carbon into the atmosphere. So that's the dramatic loss of the pinyon trees. Another example, also from the United States, this is the moose. With warmer and shorter winters, they found that there are more ticks. Would you believe 150,000 ticks can actually swarm one poor moose, leading to loss of blood and the moose becoming anemic? The moose starts losing hair from scratching the ticks, and with that it starts losing body heat when rains come. And you can imagine what the ultimate conclusion is: dramatic decline in the moose population. Now, is climate change the direct result of the moose population decline? Probably not, but you can see that it has an impact. It's very complex, it interacts with so many things, and it just compounds some of these threats that species are already facing. But let us not forget, there's another species that's also equally vulnerable, and that is us. We are also part of this biodiversity of this planet. And increasingly, despite the advances that we have made in the industrial age in getting clean water, good energy supply, good health, medication, public health, habitats, nice homes to live in, we are actually coming to a point where we are threatened by things that threaten our very basic ability to survive. Food security. Our paddy fields, when they don't get rains at the right time, don't produce as much yield. Reduce air quality. I don't think anybody in this room is unfamiliar with what's now become, unfortunately, the normal haze incidents. Water security, we heard about it earlier, and of course all of us had experienced water security in a country which we shouldn't really be facing such an issue. We have, I think, 3,000 millimeters of annual rainfall, and yet we are facing an issue like this: water security. Habitat security. We have homes that might be built along the coastlines that might be vulnerable to increased storm surges, homes on slopes which might be susceptible to landslides. So ultimately, we are affecting our health and our very ability to survive on planet Earth. So that's where we are right now. So what I'm going to tell you now is the importance of why we need to move very rapidly into the age of sustainable development to ensure that all the benefits that we have captured during the industrial age remains and continues to serve us, rather than coming to a tipping point where we are no longer having any of those facilities, those abilities that has enabled us to survive all this time. So what can we do? I think this carnival is a wonderful idea, and all of you will probably get a lot of good ideas when you wander around the stalls and carnival exhibits outside. But basically, travel wisely, so avoid using carbon-intensive traveling mechanisms. Use energy wisely. Try and opt for renewable energy. Eat wisely. Consume wisely. Try and eat local as far as possible. Reducing meat consumption is good. Practice the 3R. Consume less. Recycle. And reuse. And also be the voice. Be advocates for change. Speak about this. Speak to people, tell them what needs to be done. And trees. We need trees because apart from their beauty, they also provide a very important service. They recycle the carbon in the atmosphere and change it to oxygen that we use. They also provide food. All these things can be considered to be mitigatory measures, measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is very important, that we start consuming wisely, okay? However, at the same time, we also need to take measures to adapt to the changing climate, because the climate is already changing. We are all committed to live through some changes in the climate, because for the effects of all those mitigatory measures to stabilize the climate at that 2-degree point that we hope it will stabilize at, it'll take a course of time. In the course of time, the climate is just not going to be stationary. The climate will also be changing. So we need to be prepared. We need to be sure that we can withstand this change and be around in the future when the climate stabilizes. So since I'm talking about biodiversity, there are a lot of other ways to adapt, but I think a very, very important way, which maybe doesn't get highlighted often enough, is that we need to invest in biodiversity and nature. Okay? And how do we do that? We have, as I mentioned earlier, we are a mega biodiverse rich country, so we should ensure that we continue to be a mega biodiverse rich country. We should ensure that we have good forest areas, connected forest areas, not fragmented forest areas, so that species have the space to move as they need to in order to adapt on their own. We need to make sure that measures are there to protect species, our biological diversity now, to enable them to evolve and take the measures needed to adapt to the changing climate. We need to make sure that our planning looks at it from a spatial perspective, an ecosystem perspective, not just from just here we do this, there we do this in a sectoral way, no. And even in the urban spaces, we should start having more green spaces. We can create urban forests. We should create vegetable gardens. We can go for organic farming. All these things help to reduce the stressors that our human activity has imposed upon Mother Earth. By doing so, we can create resilience within our ecosystem within this planetary system, and we can restore the balance. I've put this little fellow up there, the little bee, because I want to share this story with you. Recently, a friend of mine told me that she lives in an area which was adjacent to a forest or a green space. And recently, that space had been cut down to make way for some development. And she lives in an apartment block. Every morning, she washes her clothes, hangs it out to dry. And she said, after the cutting of the green space, her husband said, you know, after you go to work, I noticed that there are bees that come to the clothes. So what was happening was, the bees had lost the normal places where they would forage, and they were thinking that the clothes that she had hung out, because they were colorful, and also she probably, I mean, she used softener or whatever, so they had some sweet smell. The bees thought this was now their source of food. Now that is sad, you know? So we really need to think about what our activities are doing, what we are actually doing to things around us which ultimately impact us. So if we recreate that balance, we create the resilience, we will ensure that we have good quality air to continue breathing. We'll ensure that our water quality remains good. Our forests, all the natural systems provide very efficient filtration of water that we drink. And this will continue to happen if we look after our biodiversity properly and invest in it. We'll continue having our food source. And also security. This is a mangrove planting. Mangroves actually protect coastal areas from the onslaught of things like storm surges. And before I forget, our friend the bee plays a very important role in terms of our food. They are a pollinator, just like the bats that pollinate our durians, the flying foxes, the birds. So we actually rely on our biodiversity immensely, but often we don't pay heed to the amount of services, the amount of value that they give, the richness that they bring to our lives. So I'd just like to leave you with these key messages. Human action in the industrial age has definitely changed our climate. The industrial, post-industrial age has caused the depletion and degradation of biodiversity through excessive use. Change in climate can have a direct or indirect impact on biodiversity. And as we saw, it is very, very, very complex. Climate impacts compound existing human impacts on biodiversity. And let us not forget, man is part of the planet's biodiversity. Impact of climate change can be immediate or can set in very slowly. We need to change and quickly advance into the age of sustainable development. Our actions can reduce greenhouse gas emissions to stabilize the climate in the future, and at the same time create resilience to withstand the impacts of climate change that we are already committed to in the meantime. Hence, mitigation and adaptation to climate change complement each other, and they must be undertaken together. Restoring the balance ultimately will help ensure our very own survival. Thank you.